talk about this crisis that's happening in Boston and New York City and how this could actually start to spread to other cities as well. There was a recent report that was released that says many young people are ready to leave the Boston area. So let's start with Boston first, because I think this is something that I've been hinting towards for quite some time. And I've seen the change, having lived here over 11 years. I've seen the shift. Many young people are ready to leave the Boston area. Now, this is a new survey that was just released. I'll see if I'll make it a little bit bigger because I know you guys like the bigger text. Okay. With the region already grappling with workforce shortages, a quarter of young professionals living in Greater Boston intend to move somewhere else over the next 5 years as they navigate their career prospects and housing affordability. This is a new survey that was released. While the vast majority of people ages 20 to 30 said they're overall satisfied with their daily lives in Boston, an alarming 25% of individuals do not intend to stay in the region for the long haul, according to the survey from the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce Foundation and its City Awake program for young professionals. So let me just dive in here for just a second and we'll come back to the article. This is something that former Mayor Marty Walsh was actually trying to warn people about when he became mayor of Boston, is that the younger populations, the younger professionals are choosing to leave this particular city. And there's a number of reasons, and we'll get into that. Marty Walsh did try to find ways to make the city a little bit more lively in reference to the nightlife. Now, don't get me wrong. You can come here and you can go to a good bar and you can party and have a great time. But when you compare it to other cities, even the nightlife here in Boston, it doesn't really, it's not as great as when you compare it to a city like New York or LA or Chicago. So that was something that he did try to change when he was mayor. I don't agree with all the decisions that he made when he was mayor, but he wanted to keep public transportation open longer. Our transit system here, I think the last call is 1 o'clock in the morning. That doesn't just affect the nightlife, but that also affects people that are working third shift, right? They have to rely on another source to get to work. So he did try to do these things. And then he received that offer from the Biden administration to work with his office in DC, and he left his mayor position. And the next thing you know, we ended up with Mayor Wu. So here we go. With this positive reflection of young residents and their experience in Greater Boston, it is imperative that the region's future and current workforce are able to stay in the region with the high quality of life and transformative policies and connections that amplify opportunities. With this survey, the Chamber Foundation is committed to using the data to understand and magnify the concerns of the region's young residents through essential convenings and the promotion of civic engagement and policy solutions. The survey probed 823 young adults in November and December who lived in Essex, Middlesex, Norfolk, Plymouth, and Suffolk counties. Let's dive in here. Results show that 27% of respondents were somewhat likely to stay. 38% reported they were very likely to stay. Another 10% were unsure or did not answer. Of the 25% of respondents who plan to leave, 16% were somewhat likely to do so, and 9% were very likely, the survey found. More than half of respondents have said they feel they have little to no power in state or federal government to make changes in the issues they care about, such as affordable housing, availability of quality jobs, and financial compensation and wages. I don't think this is unusual when you compare this to other big cities as well. I've told you multiple times the housing issue here in Boston is a problem. I have watched over the years these one-bedroom apartments, the rent just continues to increase. I remember when you could get a $900 one-bedroom apartment in the Alston neighborhood in Boston. You can't do that anymore. So the cost of rent has continued to increase. Meanwhile, people's salaries aren't necessarily increasing to keep up with that. So that's part of the problem. Availability of quality jobs. You know, what are these jobs that these kids are being offered? I told you recently that a study from the Higher Education Institute actually said a lot of the college graduates, more than half of them now, are underemployed. So that means that the jobs that they are getting, they're actually overqualified for. So the pay is obviously going to be less. And of course, it mentions financial compensation and wages. And we'll get to this piece here. This part is important. The survey found Black women, LGBTQ individuals are more likely to plan to leave Greater Boston. Women ages 28 to 30, people who identify as Asian American and Pacific Islander, and people in management occupations are more likely to stay in Boston. Now, why is that? Well, obviously, if you're in a management occupation, your salary is probably higher, so you can probably afford to pay high rent here, right? That's one thing. This piece here about Black women and LGBTQ individuals, it doesn't surprise me that Black women are more likely to leave the Boston area. I've heard complaints from people all over the years that have lived here that it can be very difficult, I think, to find your footing here in Boston. This city is different than other cities. When you compare it to New York, it's just the social life is different, the nightlife is different, and it is pretty much a college town. So I think what happens for a lot of people is they may come here for college, and then once they graduate, they realize, okay, I want something a little bit more lively, or I want to live in a place where I can build community. And I think what a lot of people have found is it's very difficult to build community in the greater Boston area. Part of that has to do with the fact that Boston tends to be a little bit more, or Bostonians tend to be a little bit more reserved. They are less likely to be friendly to people that are not from the neighborhood. I noticed that when I first moved here. This is not to say they're mean. They're just less likely to trust you. It takes longer to build friendships with people who grew up here. I'm just keeping it real about that one. Out of all the places I live, this has been, I think, one of the hardest places to kind of like crack into that bubble, you know, like of the locals. And part of that has to do with the fact is that a lot of people come here for college and they don't really want to stay here. Part of that is due to the weather. A lot of people will leave after they have 1 or 2 winters here and they're like, I can't do this anymore. I'm going somewhere else that's warmer. That's part of the reason why a lot of people leave. We just don't have the best weather. New York is 3 hours from here, but New York is still warmer than Boston and they don't get as much snow that we do here. So that's a big part of it. I was surprised to see LGBTQ individuals are more likely to leave Boston because Massachusetts was the first state to legalize gay marriage. So I was actually kind of surprised by that. And from what I've understood from people that are a part of that community is that there is a community for the LGBTQ individuals in this area, and it tends to be a little bit more progressive than you will experience in other places that I've lived. So I was actually kind of surprised by that one. Survey respondents were asked about the importance of various factors guiding their decision to live in Boston. Cost of rent was important for 83% of respondents. So you guys see the housing issue. Job availability for 87%. Ability to buy a home for 78%. Efficient public transportation / mobility, 72%. Proximity to family, 68%, and affordability and availability of childcare, 60%. All in all, it basically comes down to the cost of living, right? So we talked about housing, we talked about the jobs. Obviously, it's difficult to buy a home here. Houses are very expensive in Boston. I don't know if you guys, not even just in Boston, but even greater Boston, housing, it's every year you have to move further and further out to try to find a house that you can afford. It's ridiculous. There's a house for sale down the street from me. It's a Cape Cod, right? Okay. I haven't lived in this house that long, so just keep that in mind. They're selling that house for $750,000. It's a Cape Cod. It has 3 bedrooms. A Cape Codder house here, it's a smaller home. So it's ridiculous. That's right, Mastermind Hour. The rent is too damn high. You're right. Like, this is a big problem. The other piece here is public transportation. Anyone that you have talked to or you know that lives in the Boston area will tell you Our public transportation system is a mess. Yes, it was the first one in the country, but it's not efficient. The New York public transportation system is way more efficient. It runs 24 hours. In Boston, that is not the case. I can't tell you how many times they shut down an entire line, whether it's usually the green line. The red line has its problems as well, too. But it's not efficient, and it doesn't go to some of the areas where people can afford to live. So then you got to have a car. So there's a lot to go here. Childcare is very expensive, but a lot of these younger people are not having children anyway. So that's probably why that's one of the more, that item is lower on the list. But listen to this part here. The survey also found a potential relationship between people who are dissatisfied with Boston and want to leave, and how difficult they find transportation to be on a daily basis. That could point to racial disparities, the survey said, since young people of color ride the T and the bus at higher rates than their counterparts. Also mainly college students too. In the workplace, young adults reported high satisfaction levels with coworkers, but only 55% said they are satisfied with their pay. Only half said they were satisfied by opportunities or promotions at work. This is also why a lot of young professionals are more likely to bounce around. This is part of the reason why, because they're not getting promotions. So in order to get a decent increase, they have to go to another company. Listen to this part here. This is the one I think those of us that are in the Boston area, I think we need to start. We could do a better job at this. In other potential explanations driving decisions about moving, 22% of young adults said they also found it difficult to build community relationships in Boston. That is one of the reasons why a lot of people that I've met that have moved here and they left 1 year later is because of that reason. Even those who could afford to live here, they said it's very hard to build community here. And it is. It is. I'm telling you, if you lived in any of those neighborhoods, you know, especially some of the ones that are a little bit older, like Dorchester is an older neighborhood in Boston. People have been there for like generations. And like I said, they're not actually very welcoming to new people, right? So that's something to think about. I think we could do better with that, guys. I really think that we could. Jinho said Boston is a parochial city divided along town and gown class lines. Graduates are expected to live near university campuses. Southie perpetuates this trope from my years at Harvard. Very good point there, Jinho. And what's up, Jinho? I'm assuming you don't live here anymore. Like, yeah, a lot of people leave. They come here. They may be excited when they first get here, but then they leave. Most of the people that I met, I would say the first 5 years I lived here, no longer live here. We can work on this, guys. I think we can improve that. And then it also says, the survey said, more entertainment options. So that's another one too. We don't have the most robust nightlife. I'm just keeping it real. They could do a better job. Now we're going to go to New York City, because New York is also having this issue. I don't know if you guys knew about this, but check this out. New York City's population shrinks by 78,000. According to census data. Let's get into this. Now, this was reported this month. It says New York City's population declined again last year, according to new census estimates. But city officials said that those figures did not fully account for the growing number of migrants, which would have resulted in a minimal drop being reported. The city lost nearly 78,000 residents in 2023, shrinking its population from 8.26 million people, according to the estimates, which were released on Thursday. In 2022, it lost more than 126,000 residents. So think about this, guys. Even after the height of the pandemic, which was 2020, people are still leaving New York City. And people left Boston too during 2020. But this trend is continuing. From April 20th to July 2023, the city lost almost 550,000 residents, or more than 6% of its population. This is wild, son. Whew. And then they're talking about the population loss isn't accounting for migrants that have come to the city. But I don't think they would have included them in the census anyway. But this part right here, it's very true that lots of well-off people left high-income areas temporarily, and many of them have come back, but it's the struggling people that leave for good. 4 out of 5 boroughs continue to see population declines in 2023. The Bronx, the city's poorest borough, shrank the most by nearly 1.9%, losing more than 25,000 residents. That's according to analysis by Social Explorer. Brooklyn lost more than 28,000. Queens lost more than 26,000. Man. So I will say this, I was just in New York recently, and in Manhattan, you do see a difference in the population. When I lived in New York, I remember the streets being crowded, like flooded with people. But I was just in New York for my birthday earlier this month, and you do see that big difference, particularly in Manhattan. Now, if you go out to Brooklyn, I think more people are going out that way, right? You do see more people there. There's also more people out in Queens, but you can definitely notice the difference, I think, for any of us that have been around that way. For the second straight year, Manhattan, the richest borough, was the only one to grow, however, slightly. It gained nearly 3,000 residents in 2023 after adding more than 16,000 residents the year before. Still, Manhattan's population, just under 1.6 million residents, was almost 97,000 less than it was in 2020. The city's decrease represented about 3/4 of New York State's overall population decline of nearly 102,000 in 2023. Upstate New York lost more than 15,000 residents. So it's happening there as well. What does this all really mean in the grand scheme of things? This brings us into this concept of shrinking cities. And this is happening. And I think we need to look at where this is going to take us going forward in the future. People are leaving the cities. Part of this has to do with the cost of living increase, but another part of it has to do with the option for remote work. You know, when the pandemic happened, some of the companies actually gave employees the opportunity to work remotely indefinitely, not just during the pandemic. So some of those people said, well, why am I spending all this money to live in the city so I'm close to my job? If I can work remotely, I can just go live somewhere else. And that's what some people have done, not just New York, not just Boston, but also cities like San Francisco. I want to show you a clip here because I want you to remember what happened to Detroit. Detroit was once a thriving city. Lots of jobs. A lot of people moved to the Motor City. Remember this? Hearing about the history of it? There were so many jobs available in Detroit, factories, etc. But something happened to Detroit. And the more people leave these cities, we could be looking at other future Detroits. Not to say this is going to happen 5-10 years from now, but are we already heading there? Check out this clip here, the big problem behind shrinking cities.
This is Detroit, a previously wealthy city that has now become the poster child for the places that economic prosperity has left behind. The story of Detroit's decline from an economic powerhouse to a city where roughly 35% of its residents live below the poverty line is so well documented that we'll receive very little value from rehashing it here. To oversimplify a ridiculously complex story, Detroit used to have one of the strongest auto manufacturing industries in the world. Competition from foreign manufacturing plants suddenly made Detroit an unattractive destination for building cars. As jobs in the car manufacturing industry became scarce, Detroit was unable to pivot to higher value industries that could sustain its economy. And when the jobs left, the people that could leave Detroit did. Detroit's population today is about 1/3 of its population at its peak. But Detroit isn't the only city that has had a hard time attracting new residents. In fact, scientists estimate that 25% of cities across the world saw their populations decline between 2013 and 2018. They also predict that the number of shrinking cities will grow to roughly 37% of all cities between 2018 and 2050. The people with the means to leave will always leave. However, the people who are forced to stay will find themselves in a city that offers poor public services, few job opportunities, and the social problems that come with them.
That's the part that I'm the most concerned about, ladies and gentlemen. This part right here. Oops, I'm trying to get it just right there. poor public services, and few job opportunities and social, right? Because the reality is, ladies and gentlemen, the more people leave these cities, the companies are less likely to stay as well. That's what happened to Detroit. When people left Detroit, the companies started to leave. So when the jobs leave, what happens? Let's continue a little bit more
and the
here.
social problems that come with them. To avoid becoming the next Detroit, cities across the globe are rushing to implement policies to attract new residents. These policies range from the boring, think tax breaks or fancy amenities, to the more creative. For instance, many rural areas in Japan are offering free homes to attract new residents. But maybe the push for new residents is misplaced. The fact is that not every city can be a growing city. The United Nations estimates that the global population will stabilise by 2100. If you live in New York, Toronto or San Francisco, then you might think that your city could never become a shrinking city. And you might be right. But of course, mid-20th century Detroiters believed that as well. So, what is the history of shrinking cities?
And we'll pause there. We're not going to get into the whole history about that tonight, but I do want to bring in the solution, or what he believes is the solution for this, or where we're actually going to be headed in the future. He mentioned San Francisco, but one thing I do want to add about San Francisco, from what I understand, people actually did start leaving San Francisco because the rent was so high, and some people were moving to places like Oakland. But now I've been told that Oakland is also expensive because so many people moved there. People have moved to places like San Jose. I heard San Jose is not affordable anymore now. So these are the anchor cities. This is what he believes is going to happen to these cities in the future.
Areas. This emphasises the importance of having an anchor city that supports these smaller regions. Not every shrinking city can neighbour a large metropolis, but with support from higher levels of government, shrinking cities can establish stronger economic ties with their closest economic juggernaut. In some ways, urban planning may take a page out of the Garden City we mentioned earlier, where smaller communities circle larger cities.
Pause. So he's talking about smaller cities circling larger cities. So like, what would be the anchor city for Boston, right? I guess someone may mention like Worcester. It's kind of further out. It's like an hour away. But I'm guessing like San Francisco, was Oakland that anchor city? Was San Jose that anchor city? What about New York City? Some people might say that Jersey City was that anchor city, but now Jersey City is expensive too. If this is the future of where we are headed, where people are leaving the big cities and they're going to the next city closest to it, which may be a little bit more affordable. If everyone continues to do that, then eventually those cities are going to become unaffordable as well. So this is not the solution. These things can be fixed though, but we need to start looking at this now and figuring out how we're going to handle this today. I would call on the tech companies, the Microsoft, the Google, the Facebook. Why do you only have your companies on the West Coast and the East Coast in these metropolitan areas? Why aren't you building other locations in rural America like Iowa, or in places like Indiana or in Kansas? You know why? These companies usually set up shop in the cities that have the colleges that are actually implementing these, giving out these degrees, those computer engineerings and, you know, computer programmer degrees. So they usually put locations next to those universities. This is why you have the Facebook and the Google and the Microsoft all right next to each other in Kenmore Square, right next to MIT. But that's going to have to change. Eventually, these companies need to be branching out. They need to go to rural America so that people will be inspired to stay in those towns and that they can have gainful employment. But what we're seeing right now is a lot of these companies only want to be concentrated on the East Coast and the West Coast, where it is very expensive to live. And that is going to continue to be a problem, because as long as most of the jobs are concentrated in the cities, what does that mean for the future of rural America? So it's not just about people leaving Boston and New York City. Just something I want us to think about. We have to think about these things because I've lived in both. I've lived in rural areas and I've lived in, the urban metropolitan areas. And I got to tell you, there are some towns in this country where like the only job or the only employer in town is Walmart or Amazon warehouse. Something's got to change there.